Hi, folks. I'm Father Joe Grimaldi. You can call me Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast. But now, here's our host and friend, Ken Calvert.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ken Calvert, and once again, I am joined by the good Padre, Father Joe Grimaldi, and welcome to the Father Joe Podcast, brought to you and proudly supported by Hoot & McInerney's Star Lincoln 12 Mile Road and Telegraph in Southfield. And the 14th edition wish list sales event is going on now and runs through January 2nd, 2019. You can lease the 2019 Lincoln MKC for only $257 a month, and the stunning new 2019 Lincoln Nautilus for only $387 a month. See Star Lincoln for details. Star Lincoln 12 Mile Road and Telegraph in Southfield. Experience the Star treatment. Well, I trust, my friend, you had a great Christmas.
I thought it was wonderful. The festive spirit, all of these good things, and then, obviously we ate a little too much, but it's part of the season if you want, and I've got more cookies than you can imagine. We have cookies to last me till, Labor Day, if not, maybe just the 4th of July, but anyway, a lot of cookies. I'm sure that you were not lacking in cookies here either.
Not at all.
That's why I didn't. I was thinking about that this morning, but I said, they probably have more than I do.
Yeah, and look, you got a cupcake right next to you.
I know, isn't that amazing? Container. I could look at it.
I won't let it out of the container until that's his reward for doing the podcast.
At least.
Well, Christmas was wonderful, and coming upon the new year, this is an exciting week, as we have been saying all along. Christmas does not end at midnight Christmas night. It's only just begun the 12 days of Christmas.
Correct.
Today's called Boxing Day in Canada and in other parts of the world, but it's also a very, very important feast day, the feast day of St. Stephen.
Correct.
And I'm going to regale you with some of my background knowledge.
Please.
All right. He was the first Christian martyr.
Right.
About 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Wow, you've read up on this.
And he was stoned to death, if I'm not mistaken, while praying for those who were persecuting him, putting him to death.
Correct.
Somewhere in that crowd, there was a spectator who also has a link to St. Stephen, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And I think he may have been the one that we once called Saul, who eventually became Paul, not to be confused with the
first king of Israel.
Right. So that's what I have for you in my tank. And so today is the feast day of St. Stephen. Very important person. Want to add one thing to it.
Sure.
He's referred to as well as one of the 7 deacons that assisted the apostles. Do you know that particular element of the liturgy is about the deacons that assisted the apostles?
Well, see what happened at the early church. They tried to do the right things. They were commemorating the death of Jesus on a regular basis, and that's what the Mass is. If we look at it, it's a commemoration of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's what the liturgy is all about whenever we have Mass. And so in those days, Mass was not as formal as it is today. Mass is much more, at that time, much more practical, and people were given bread to eat. That was the bread that they broke together in the name of Jesus Christ, and they drank wine. Okay, one of the problems that arose in the early community was the widows, the orphans. People seemed to neglect them. There was a lot of tension between the Hellenistic Christians and the Jewish Christians and so on, because you had still, the evolution of Christianity did not fully become defined. And so you had these different little groups complaining, why aren't they taking care of the widows? Why aren't they taking care of the Greek-speaking Christians? Why aren't they taking care of the Jewish-speaking? And so on and so forth. So they needed to establish some sort of an office that would take care of these people. And so they came up with the idea of ordaining men who were not priests, but would be taking care of the needs of the church. Now, even today, by the way, when someone is ordained a deacon, they're not just flower pots on the altar that we see them, okay?
Yeah.
They are working. So, for example, They might be assisting the needs of people in a hospital. They might be visiting the nursing homes. They might be bringing communion to those who are homebound, and so on. So they're actually doing a lot of the work to help the church out in so many different ways.
And deacons do homilies.
And, well, that's the other thing. You see, when that was the thing that at that time was prominent. Now, interestingly enough, you bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
Many priests are not in favor of having the deacons preach.
In a way, I kind of understand that.
It's the right of the deacon to preach. As you notice, whenever you have a liturgy, if a deacon is present, he's the one who reads the gospel, not the priest.
Right.
And usually, if he's allowed, he can give the homily. Now, as I say, I don't think we've evolved that much in the church where every time there is a liturgy, the deacon preaches. No, it's not like that at all. So it's on occasion, like some churches say, our deacons preach once a month or once every 2 months or whatever the case might be. They have some limitation on it. But so here we have Stephen. He was ordained as one of the deacons at the time to take care of all of these extra needs of the church. And he was very good at it. He was inspired in so many ways. He certainly believed in Jesus and who he was. And he certainly believed in the crucifixion of the Lord and what that accomplished, the salvation of mankind. And so he had a special role to play in the early church. He was looked upon with a great deal of awe in the beginnings and so on. So here we have Stephen got the higher-ups very upset because he was looking at Jesus as the Messiah that everybody was supposed to be waiting for. Well, that infuriated the people around him. They said, this guy's got to go, you see. Meanwhile, in the background, unassuming, you had the great persecutor of the church, Saul. And Saul was kneeling there, just being very humble. But when he saw how Stephen reacted to the stoning, how Stephen reacted to the infuriation of the higher-ups, of the people, the church people at the time, he was truly impressed, because what happens is Stephen echoes the words of Jesus. Basically what he says, be kind to them, is what he says. Forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. So he echoes the words of Jesus Christ. And so Saul was so inspired by that he gave himself up to the Lord, and he received the Lord in his heart. Now, we know the story of Saul and Paul, and it didn't happen automatically, but it was a little beginning, if you want, of Paul's transition. He started to think about it more and more, and eventually, of course, we know he was struck down. It's interesting how the artists love to see him falling off a horse, and the poets do the same thing, and so on and so forth, because there's lots of beautiful artwork. Caravaggio has beautiful artwork of Saul falling off the horse and all of this. Well, there was no horse. The Bible doesn't say anything about a horse. But basically, that's the way they picture it.
As you've said so many times, there's a lot of artistic license and drama included in these stories. So continue.
But, the important thing is that he was struck. What is in the Bible is that he was struck. And it's from then on, he started to truly believe. But the Lord sent him for a little bit of training, if you want, because he couldn't see for a while and so on. And you might call it the RCIA, if you want, of the early days. So he eventually became Paul, not Saul, and probably the most prolific writer of Scripture. As a matter of fact, if you read Romans, that's the heart of everything we believe in He was expounding on that beautifully. So, in any case, that's the story, Paul. Interestingly enough, if you try to go to church yesterday or the day before, the eve of Christmas, interestingly enough, many of the Protestant churches don't even do services on Christmas Day.
They don't, really?
They do all of the services the eve, because that's when people like to.
Oh.
So, and the Catholic Church gets most of the people coming on the eve of Christmas. But basically, Christmas Day, well, they're somewhat empty, the churches. You get big numbers on the eve, because particularly with the children's pageants and so on.
Well, when we were talking, I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because one of the things that we were talking about at our Christmas last night was the fact that we all got a kick out of that line. People calling the rectory back in the day saying, what time is midnight mass?
I love it.
Well, we've got one at 4, we got one at 8, we got one at 9. And the church down the street's got one at 10.
10.
And then we have the granddaddy, which is at midnight.
The real midnight mass.
Yeah. So more people go on Christmas Eve.
But that's not my point.
Including our Protestant brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. But what I was saying, though, is that yesterday, and when I say yesterday, Christmas Eve is included. You could hardly get a seat in the church because it's so crowded. And now today, this morning, the churches were very sparse. And there were other changes, too. Yesterday, we wore white, glorious white. It's the feast of Christmas.
Yep.
Although people think you should be wearing red, but that's not it. And then today, we wore red because Stephen was a martyr.
Okay.
And so somebody said to me today, well, you're in the Christmas spirit. I said, no, it's the opposite today. Yesterday, we were celebrating the birth of a child.
Yeah.
Today was celebrating the martyrdom of Stephen. Yeah. And so because of the martyrdom, and the other thing is...
See, now that person needs to start listening to the Father Joe podcast and realize that playing the part of that person is Ken Calvert. That's my job, sir. Right. That's my job to say to Father Joe, hey, you should be wearing red. It's Christmas.
But then this whole week is considered Christmas Day.
Oh, I did not know that.
Oh, yes. The old octave... Well, see, the 2 octaves at Christmas and Easter, they celebrate Christmas all week and they celebrate Easter all week. So from the birth of Christ to his circumcision, it's always, always Christmas Day. And how do we indicate that?
How do we indicate that?
Well, there's a Gloria every day. Every day there's a Gloria this week. Ordinarily you don't have the Gloria during the weekday masses, but this week there is, because we're celebrating Christmas Day. I guess what I was trying to get my point across is this. The liturgy of the church reflects life, ordinary life. In ordinary life, we have high points and low points. The high points, we have tremendous celebrations like the 25th, the 50th wedding anniversary, the marriage, birth of a new child. All of these things are beautiful celebrations for families and so on. And then the next day we get back to reality.
Praying for the sick.
And so
burying our friends or our family.
Back to reality, because life is like that. Life is celebration, but then every day is an ordinary day. And so
that's why we know how to celebrate.
Yeah.
Because we have to have some basis for that comparison.
Well, there's almost a rude reminder that, okay, we're finished now with the celebration, even though we're still keeping Christmas in mind. But we're all of a sudden, we go back to the reality of life. So I'm glad you brought up the Feast of St. Stephen, because obviously, you remember that there is a song attached to that on the Feast of Stephen.
If you want to sing it, go ahead.
No, I can't sing. Well, but anyway,
it's just... Came through the door singing it.
Good King Wenceslas looked out on the Feast of Stephen. But anyway, so it's a beautiful event, I think, in the church, and it celebrates deacons. Very often they're not celebrated enough, and it brings to mind that they do have an important role to play in the church.
I have a hypothetical. We can only ponder this.
Give me the hypothetical. Okay, I like that. Hypothetical.
Do you think Jesus would have had a 13th apostle if he were alive and had come across... Is Stephen worthy of being an apostle? You see, unfortunately, he came 2 years after the crucifixion. but he sounds like a terrific human being and certainly could have been in the fold with the others.
But look at Paul.
Yeah, well, there you go. There's another one.
He was not one of the originals.
That's true.
So he's called the Apostle Paul.
Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, Simon, James,
Oh,
Judas,
very
and Jude.
good. Very. I can't do that, but you can. I think that's great.
Last of all, Matthias.
But Paul is the man. So he became known as an apostle.
Yes.
He was not one of the originals. Because of what he did, he certainly he really deserves that title. When you look at his writings, they're amazing.
So we've covered everything.
Almost. It's kind of interesting. The diaconate, that there's discussion on whether or not women can be deacons.
I think they should be, just for the record.
And you look at, like the Apostle Paul, he had a lot of women doing his work for him so many ways.
Look at the church now.
Yeah, and today the churches, without the women, I think the churches would have to close up.
Without the nuns, we would have closed.
Yeah, so it's something that I think could be considered and might even be in the process of being considered. I don't know.
All right.
But it's besides the transitional deacon,
okay,
there are permanent deacons. And so permanent deacons would be people like Stephen. So, for example, most of our churches have permanent deacons. The reason I say that, when somebody is studying for the priesthood, when he gets close to finishing his studies, he is usually ordained a deacon, maybe a year, 6 months. There's no set time, but usually at least 6 months before the actual priesthood ordination. We call that transitional deacons.
Oh.
So the others, where I work, we have Deacon Oscar and Deacon Mike and so on. They are permanent deacons. Permanent deacons are married usually, and they do a lot of the work that I had mentioned earlier. So we have a lot of permanent deacons. They have not been part of our church for many years, but they did become so about 40 years ago is when we started to ordain permanent deacons. Now, the one thing that sometimes is disturbing for people is the fact that they have to take the vow of celibacy, and which means, in that case, that if the wife should pass on, they're not allowed to remarry.
Oh.
And that's always a pretty big problem that prevents people from becoming deacons. And I've seen deacons who have been married for 40, 50 years. The wife dies, and now they can't remarry. Now, it probably wouldn't even be an important point for them, but you know how it is.
Sure.
When you know you can't, that's when you want, okay? And so
is that how that works?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So the thing is this, they're not allowed to be married because they have to take the vow of celibacy. A lot of people don't realize that.
We did an entire podcast on deacons.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, my recollection is not, I'm not sure if that was established or talked about at the time, but that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think this has really been a fabulous, interesting, compelling, and one of my favorite podcasts of 2018, and we don't have a lot of time left in 2018.
No, we don't.
So thank you for a great job. Should I tease the people and tell them that coming up next, we're going to talk about the Holy Family and the feast thereof?
By all means.
I think that's another big one. Thank you so much for joining us on the Father Joe Grimaldi podcast, proudly supported by Hoot McInerney, Starlink and 12 Mile Road, and Telegraph in Southfield. Thank you, Father Joe.
You get special treatment if you go to Starlincoln.
Look at this guy. He's becoming a pro broadcaster.
I doubt it.
It's worth the effort. We'll see you next time, everybody.
I look forward to it. Take care. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe podcast.
If you'd like, you can email us. It's frjoepodcast@gmail.com. That's frjoepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook. Simply search Father Joe Grimaldi. And thanks for listening, everyone.